When we talk about sexuality in narcissistic personalities, we have to be very clear about what is actually happening beneath the surface. For a narcissistic person, sex is rarely experienced as mutual intimacy, emotional connection, or shared vulnerability. Instead, it functions as external validation. It is a way to regulate their fragile sense of self, to confer desirability, power, relevance, and control. Sexual attention becomes a form of narcissistic supply, proof that they still matter, that they can still elicit longing, admiration, or pursuit from another person. Because of that, the absence of sex is not simply about physical deprivation. It is psychologically destabilizing. When sexual validation disappears, the narcissistic person is not just missing pleasure. They are losing a regulatory mechanism that props up their identity. This is why periods of sexual withdrawal, rejection, or emotional distance can feel profoundly threatening to them. What some might label as sexual weakness is not a biological issue or a loss of libido. It is the exposure of a fragile identity that depends on being desired to feel real and intact. In healthy relationships, sexual desire ebbs and flows. It is influenced by trust, safety, stress, health, and emotional closeness. In narcissistic dynamics, however, sex is often disconnected from empathy or reciprocity. It is transactional, performative, and centered on validation rather than bonding. When sex disappears, the illusion the narcissist holds that they are powerful, irresistible, and in control begins to crack. What surfaces instead is dependence, emptiness, and emotional dysregulation. This shift affects multiple layers of the narcissist's functioning. Their sense of dominance is threatened, their self-image becomes unstable, and their ability to regulate emotions weakens. You may see changes in mood, increased defensiveness, irritability, or attempts to reassert control in other ways. These reactions are not expressions of healthy longing or attachment, but response to a loss of psychological scaffolding that sex was providing in the relationship. Sexual validation for a narcissistic personality function less like a shared emotional experience and more like a regulatory device. It is not primarily about closeness, attunement, or mutual desire. Instead, it becomes a way to stabilize mood, quiet insecurity, and reinforce a fragile sense of superiority. When sexual access is available, it provides immediate feedback that the narcissist is wanted, powerful, and relevant. That feedback acts almost like an emotional anesthetic, temporarily numbing underlying feelings of inadequacy, emptiness, or shame that sit just beneath the surface. Because narcissistic self-worth is not internally anchored, it must be constantly sourced from the outside. Sexual desirability becomes one of the most potent sources of that validation. Being desired sexually does not simply feel good, it confirms existence and value. It signals that they can still provoke longing, that they still have influence over another person's body, emotions, and attention. Over time, their sense of identity becomes tethered to this access. They do not experience themselves as worthy and then engage in sex. They feel worthy because sex is available. This is a crucial distinction. In healthy self-worth, desire enhances connection but does not define the self. In narcissistic dynamics, desire becomes proof of selfhood. Sex also serves as a way to regulate difficult emotions. Feelings such as anxiety, envy, boredom, or self-doubt can be quickly overridden by sexual conquest or availability. The act itself, or even the anticipation of it, can elevate mood, reduce internal tension, and restore a sense of dominance. This is why sex in narcissistic relationships often carries a performative or instrumental quality. It is less about the shared moment and more about the effect it produces internally. The partner's role becomes that of a regulator rather than an equal participant. This dynamic becomes especially clear when sex is no longer available. Prolonged absence removes a critical emotional crutch. Without sexual validation, the narcissist is left alone with internal states they are poorly equipped to manage. The emptiness they have been avoiding becomes louder. Insecurity intensifies rather than dissipates. Mood becomes unstable, and irritability increases. What once felt contained through sexual access now spills out in the form of agitation, withdrawal, or hostility. Shame often emerges during this period, though it may not be recognizable as such. For narcissistic individuals, shame is deeply intolerable because it threatens the grandiose self-image. Rather than acknowledging vulnerability or hurt, the shame is often deflected outward. It can transform into rage, contempt, or devaluation of the partner. The partner may be blamed for being withholding, cold, or defective, even though the deeper issue is the narcissist's inability to self-regulate without external reinforcement. The loss of sexual access also disrupts the narcissist's sense of superiority. Being desired affirms not just worth, but hierarchy. It reinforces the belief that they are exceptional, more desirable, more powerful, or more entitled than others. When that affirmation disappears, it can feel like a collapse in status. This is why some narcissists respond to sexual absence with entitlement-driven demands, coercion, or attempts to provoke jealousy. These behaviors are not about rekindling intimacy, but about restoring dominance and regaining a sense of control over how they are perceived. It is important to differentiate this from healthy sexual frustration or longing. In secure relationships, the absence of sex may lead to sadness, curiosity, or conversations about needs and connection. There is an underlying assumption of mutual respect and shared humanity. In narcissistic dynamics, the reaction is more primitive and dysregulated. The focus is not on understanding the partner, but on alleviating internal distress as quickly as possible. Without the regulatory function of sex, many narcissistic individuals experience a form of internal chaos. Their emotional states swing more rapidly. Small frustrations feel intolerable. Criticism feels more piercing. They may become more reactive, defensive, or emotionally unavailable. Some withdraw and become cold, while others escalate in control-seeking behaviors. These shifts can be confusing and painful for the partner, who may mistakenly interpret them as signs of lost love or fading attraction. What is actually happening is not the loss of connection, but the loss of a tool. Sex was serving as a psychological mechanism to manage emptiness and stabilize identity. When that mechanism is removed, the underlying structure is exposed as fragile and dependent. The distress that follows is not rooted in grief for intimacy, but in the absence of a resource that helped the narcissist avoid confronting their internal view. In narcissistic relationships, sex is rarely neutral. It often exists within an unspoken power structure where sexual availability reinforces control, entitlement, and dominance. The narcissistic individual may come to experience access to their partner's body as confirmation of authority within the relationship. When sex is available on their terms, it reinforces the belief that they are in charge, that their needs take precedence, and that the relationship orbits around their desires. This dynamic is not always overtly coercive at first, but over time it establishes an imbalance in which sex becomes a measure of compliance rather than connection. Because of this, the absence of sex is deeply destabilizing. It undermines the narcissist's illusion of control. When sexual access disappears, the narrative that they are dominant, irresistible, and entitled to gratification begins to unravel. This loss can trigger a form of panic, not because intimacy is gone, but because authority feels threatened. The narcissistic person may experience this as an injury to entitlement, the expectation that their needs should be met without question. When that expectation is violated, the response is often disproportionate and emotionally charged. Sexual availability in narcissistic dynamics often operates as a lever of power. It becomes a way to test loyalty, enforce closeness, or punish distance. The partner may feel pressure, spoken or unspoken, to provide sex in order to maintain peace, avoid conflict, or preserve emotional stability in the relationship. Over time, this reinforces the narcissist's sense of dominance. They may come to believe that access is owed rather than mutually chosen. This entitlement is central to understanding why sexual absence feels so threatening. When sexual access is lost, the narcissist may feel exposed and powerless. This exposure can be intolerable. Rather than processing vulnerability or reflecting on relational dynamics, they often respond with retaliatory behaviors designed to restore control. Withdrawal is one common response. Emotional distance, coldness, or silence can be used as punishment, a way to reassert power by making the partner feel anxious or deprived. In other cases, the narcissist may escalate into overt blame, accusing the partner of being withholding, unloving, or defective. Triangulation is another frequent response. The narcissist may introduce the idea or reality of another person to provoke jealousy and re-establish desirability. This can take subtle forms, such as mentioning attention from others, or more overt actions, including emotional or sexual infidelity. These behaviors are not about forming genuine connections elsewhere. They are attempts to repair a damaged self-image and reclaim a sense of authority by demonstrating that they are still wanted and can still command attention. Infidelity, in this context, often functions as a corrective maneuver rather than a pursuit of intimacy. It serves to soothe the narcissist's injured entitlement, and restore the illusion of dominance. By being desired elsewhere, they can temporarily silence the internal fear that they are losing control or becoming irrelevant. This is why such behaviors often emerge suddenly after sexual withdrawal, rather than gradually over time. The partner may interpret these reactions as signs of insecurity or fading attraction, but at their core, they reflect a collapse in perceived authority. What is sometimes framed as sexual weakness is actually the narcissist's inability to maintain the belief that they are in control. The distress is not about aging, physical decline, or unmet desire. It is about losing a mechanism that reinforced hierarchy and dominance within the relationship. As control erodes, the narcissist may become more coercive. They may pressure, guilt, or manipulate the partner into resuming sexual availability. These tactics can be subtle, such as playing the victim, or more overt, such as issuing ultimatums. The goal is not to rebuild intimacy, but to restore the previous power structure in which sex functioned as proof of compliance and superiority. It is important to recognize that healthy relationships do not collapse when sexual frequency changes. In secure dynamics, shifts in desire are approached with curiosity, communication, and respect for boundaries. The presence or absence of sex does not define worth or authority. In narcissistic relationships, however, sex is intertwined with control. When it disappears, the entire structure that supported the narcissist's sense of dominance begins to falter. What emerges in that space is often volatility. The narcissist may oscillate between charm and cruelty, longing and contempt, pursuit and punishment. These swings reflect an urgent attempt to regain footing in a system that no longer confirms their authority. The absence of sex exposes the reality that control, not intimacy, was always the underlying motive. And when that control is threatened, the narcissist's behavior becomes increasingly reactive and destabilizing. For many narcissistic individuals, identity is not something that develops from within through reflection, values, or emotional continuity. Instead, it is constructed externally through feedback, through being admired, pursued, and desired. Sexual affirmation plays a particularly powerful role in this process because it provides immediate, visceral confirmation of worth. Being wanted sexually signals importance, relevance, and impact. Over time, this external feedback loop becomes the primary scaffolding for the narcissist's sense of self. When sexual affirmation is consistently available, it can mask the absence of an internal identity. The narcissist may appear confident, self-assured, or even grounded, but this stability is conditional. It depends on the steady presence of external signals that say, you are desired. Without those signals, the internal structure has little to support it. Prolonged sexual deprivation disrupts this loop and begins to erode the narcissist's self-concept in ways that can feel alarming, both to them and to those around them. As sexual affirmation fades, shame often surfaces. This shame is not simply about rejection, it is about the fear of being fundamentally unworthy or invisible. For narcissistic personalities, shame is deeply destabilizing because it threatens the carefully maintained image of superiority or specialness. Rather than experiencing shame as a passing emotion, it can feel like a total collapse of self. This is why reactions may seem extreme or disproportionate to the situation. Alongside shame, feelings of worthlessness may emerge. The narcissist may internally equate the absence of desire with personal failure. Because their self-worth is not buffered by internal validation, there's little resilience in the face of perceived rejection. This can lead to depressive symptoms such as withdrawal, apathy, or a sense of emptiness. The world may feel dull or meaningless when the usual sources of affirmation are gone, further reinforcing their dependence on external validation. Paradoxically, periods of sexual deprivation can also trigger sudden spikes in grandiosity. Rather than collapsing inward, some narcissistic individuals swing in the opposite direction. They may exaggerate their achievements, inflate their self-importance, or adopt a dismissive attitude toward those around them. This grandiosity functions as a defensive response, an attempt to counteract the rising shame and worthlessness. It is not evidence of true confidence, but of desperation to restore a sense of self through exaggeration and dominance. These oscillations between shame and grandiosity reveal a core instability. There is no consistent internal narrative that says, I am worthy regardless of external response. Instead, the self expands and contracts based on feedback. When sexual affirmation is present, the narcissist feels substantial. When it is absent, the self feels hollow or endangered. This lack of emotional self-sufficiency becomes especially visible during prolonged periods without sexual validation. The erosion of identity during these times exposes a fundamental truth about narcissistic functioning. The sense of self was never stable to begin with. It was assembled through performance, image management, and external reinforcement rather than internal integration. Sexual affirmation was one of the most efficient tools for maintaining that assembly. When it is removed, the gaps become impossible to ignore. This is often confusing for partners who may assume that reduced sexual interest would naturally lead to introspection or emotional growth. Instead, they may witness increased volatility, mood swings, or contradictory behaviors. The narcissist may appear lost one moment and inflated the next. These shifts are not strategic. They reflect an ongoing struggle to feel real in the absence of confirming feedback. What prolonged sexual deprivation ultimately reveals is not a temporary crisis, but a structural vulnerability. The narcissist's identity depends on being mirrored by others rather than anchored internally. Without that mirror, the self begins to fragment. This fragmentation underscores the absence of emotional self-sufficiency and highlights how much of the narcissist's identity was contingent on being wanted rather than on a stable, integrated sense of who they are. When sexual validation disappears, narcissistic dysregulation often intensifies in ways that are both visible and disruptive. Sexual affirmation had been functioning as a stabilizing force, a way to keep internal distress contained. Without it, the narcissistic individual may lose one of their primary tools for emotional regulation. This loss does not typically lead to quiet reflection or adaptive coping. Instead, it often results in heightened volatility as unresolved feelings surge to the surface. One of the most common shifts is increased hostility. The narcissist may become more irritable, critical, or openly aggressive, even in situations that previously would not have provoked such reactions. Minor frustrations feel magnified, and patience erodes quickly. This hostility is not random. It reflects the strain of managing internal discomfort without the buffering effect of sexual validation. Anger becomes a way to externalize distress that feels unbearable internally. Emotional volatility often accompanies this hostility. Mood swings may become more frequent and unpredictable. The narcissist may oscillate between self-pity and contempt, longing and dismissal, charm and cruelty. These fluctuations are signs of dysregulation rather than intentional manipulation. In every moment, the emotional system is overwhelmed, and without a reliable means of soothing or stabilizing, reactions become exaggerated and poorly contained. Somatic complaints may also increase during this period. The narcissist may begin to focus intensely on physical symptoms, fatigue, aches, or vague bodily discomforts. While these sensations may feel real to them, they often function psychologically rather than medically. The body becomes a stage on which internal distress is expressed. Talking about physical decline can be safer than acknowledging emotional emptiness or shame. An obsessive focus on aging or sexual performance frequently emerges as well. The narcissist may become preoccupied with perceived signs of decline, such as changes in appearance, stamina, or attractiveness. This fixation serves multiple purposes. Internally, it offers an explanation for the loss of sexual validation that does not require confronting relational dynamics or internal fragility. Externally, it can be used to solicit reassurance, sympathy, or renewed attention from others. This narrative of body weakening is often a psychological construction rather than accurate reflection of physical reality. It becomes a story the narcissist tells themselves to make sense of the sudden drop in validation. By attributing the loss of sexual attention to bodily failure, they avoid facing the deeper truth that their sense of self was dependent on external reinforcement. This narrative can also be weaponized within relationships. Expressions of vulnerability may carry an undercurrent of guilt induction or control, subtly pressuring the partner to respond with caretaking or sexual availability. The emphasis on physical decline can also mask a deeper fear of irrelevance. Aging, in this context, symbolizes the ultimate loss of desirability and control. By focusing obsessively on the body, the narcissist attempts to regain a sense of mastery over an internal collapse. Diets, exercise regimes, cosmetic procedures, or exaggerated health anxieties may suddenly become central themes. These efforts are less about well-being and more about restoring a threatened identity. As dysregulation deepens, the narcissist's capacity for empathy often diminishes further. Their internal distress consumes attention and resources, leaving little room to attune to others. The partner may feel increasingly invisible or blamed for changes that are actually rooted in the narcissist's internal instability. This can create a painful dynamic in which the partner is cast as both the cause of distress and the solution to it. It is important to understand that these behaviors are not signs of a medical crisis, while genuine heal. These issues can coexist. The pattern described here reflects a mind identity collapse rather than a bodily one. The distress originates from the loss of a regulatory mechanism and the exposure of an unstable self-concept. The body becomes a convenient explanation because it is tangible and socially acceptable, whereas emotional dependency and fragility are not. This reframing helps clarify why reassurance or caretaking rarely resolves the issue. Addressing the surface narrative of physical decline does not restore internal stability. The dysregulation persists because the core problem, the reliance on sexual validation for emotional regulation, remains unaddressed. What appears as bodily weakening is, at its core, a psychological unraveling driven by the sudden absence of a key source of narcissistic supply. The narcissist's response to sexual absence often reveals a truth that can be difficult to accept. Genuine intimacy was never the foundation of the relationship. In relationships where emotional connection is real, intimacy does not disappear. When sex becomes less frequent, it adapts. Couples find other ways to remain close through conversation, affection, shared vulnerability, and mutual care. Sexual expression may change, but the bond itself remains intact because it is supported by empathy and emotional attunement. In narcissistic relationships, the opposite tends to occur. When sexual validation diminishes, the relationship does not deepen in other forms of intimacy. It deteriorates. Emotional closeness does not expand to fill the space left by sex. Instead, there is often increased distance, tension, or hostility. This absence of adaptive intimacy is not accidental. It reflects the reality that sex was not an expression of connection, but the primary mechanism through which the narcissist related to the partner. In healthy dynamics, reduced sexual frequency might prompt curiosity. Partners ask what has changed, how each person is feeling, and what support might be needed. There is an assumption of shared humanity and goodwill. In narcissistic dynamics, the response is rarely one of curiosity or care. The focus remains on what has been lost for the narcissist rather than what might be happening emotionally within the relationship. This self-centered orientation becomes more pronounced when sexual validation is removed. Empathy, which is essential for genuine intimacy, often fails to emerge during this rupture. The narcissist may show little interest in the partner's emotional state, stressors, or boundaries. Instead of responding with concern or understanding, they may respond with blame, pressure, or withdrawal. This absence of empathic engagement exposes how little emotional reciprocity was present to begin with. Without sex as a bridge, there is nothing underneath to sustain closeness. The loss of sexual validation also reveals how conditional the relationship truly was. Affection, attention, and warmth may have been contingent on sexual availability. When that availability disappears, so does much of the apparent care. This conditionality can be deeply painful for partners who may realize that love and kindness were not freely given but were exchanged for compliance or validation. Rather than leaning into emotional connection, the narcissist often becomes more transactional. Interactions may feel colder, more distant, or more demanding. The partner may be treated as a source of frustration rather than a person with needs and experiences of their own. This shift underscores that sex was functioning as a regulatory tool. It soothed insecurity, reinforced dominance, and reassured the narcissist of their importance. When it is gone, the relationship loses its primary organizing principle. In secure relationships, intimacy is multifaceted. It includes emotional safety, shared meaning, and the ability to weather changes together. Sexual expression is one part of a larger ecosystem of connection. In narcissistic relationships, intimacy is narrow and fragile. It is heavily dependent on external validation and does not survive disruptions well. The rapid deterioration following sexual absence highlights this fragility. Partners may initially try to compensate by offering emotional closeness, reassurance, or practical support. However, these efforts often go unrecognized or are dismissed as insufficient. Emotional care does not replace sexual validation for the narcissist because it does not serve the same regulatory regulatory or dominance-related function. This mismatch can leave partners feeling unseen and unvalued, further eroding the relationship. What this rupture ultimately exposes is that sex was never about mutual connection. It was about maintaining equilibrium within the narcissist's internal world. It regulated emotions, reassured identity, and reinforced power dynamics. When that function is removed, the lack of genuine intimacy becomes impossible to ignore. The relationship does not transform into something deeper, it unravels, revealing a structure built on regulation and control rather than shared emotional life. What is often described as sexual weakness in narcissistic dynamics is better understood as a diagnostic lens rather than a personal flaw. It is not evidence of decline, failure, or loss of desirability in the ordinary sense. Instead, it reveals how deeply the narcissist's stability depended on external validation. When sexual affirmation disappears and the individual begins to unravel, what is being exposed is not emotional depth or unmet love, but a reliance on supply to maintain psychological equilibrium. This reframing is important because it shifts the focus away from blame and confusion. Partners frequently internalize the narcissist's distress, assuming they have caused harm by withholding intimacy or changing their availability. In reality, the destabilization is not caused by deprivation. It is caused by exposure. The absence of sexual validation removes a cover that had been masking dependency, insecurity, and an unstable sense of self. What surfaces in its place is not longing for connection, but the anxiety of a system that can no longer regulate itself. Recognizing this distinction can be grounding for partners who witness dramatic behavioral shifts during periods of sexual absence. Increased anger, withdrawal, manipulation, or despair may look like signs of attachment or vulnerability, but they are better understood as signs of external supply dependence. The narcissist is not grieving intimacy. They are struggling without a resource that helped them feel real, powerful, and contained. This understanding also clarifies why confrontation is rarely helpful. Directly challenging the narcissist about their behavior or pointing out inconsistency often leads to defensiveness, escalation, or further manipulation. Confrontation threatens the already fragile identity and can intensify dysregulation. Awareness, by contrast, allows partners to step out of the emotional turbulence without needing to change or fix the narcissist's experience. Awareness creates distance between observation and responsibility. Instead of asking, "What did I do wrong?" the partner can begin to ask, "What am I witnessing?" This shift supports clarity. It becomes easier to see patterns rather than isolated incidents, and to recognize that the narcissist's reactions are internally driven rather than relationally responsive. With clarity comes the possibility of boundaries. When partners understand that the narcissist's unraveling is not caused by cruelty or neglect, but by the loss of validation, they are less likely to sacrifice themselves to restore equilibrium. Boundaries become an act of self-preservation rather than punishment. They protect emotional and psychological well-being in the face of behavior that is unlikely to change through accommodation. Self-trust is often one of the first casualties in narcissistic relationships. Partners may doubt their perceptions, minimize their discomfort, or rationalize harmful dynamics, seeing the narcissist destabilize in the absence of sexual validation can paradoxically help restore that self-trust. The pattern becomes harder to deny. The realization that intimacy collapses rather than adapts provides important information about the nature of the relationship. This lens also helps disentangle compassion from self-abandonment. It is possible to acknowledge that the narcissist is distressed without assuming responsibility for regulating that distress. Understanding that the distress stems from exposure rather than deprivation allows partners to hold empathy without relinquishing boundaries. It clarifies that no amount of reassurance or availability can create internal stability where none exists. Perhaps most importantly, this refrain challenges a common misconception about intimacy. True intimacy does not disappear when validation pauses. It may change form, slow down, or require renegotiation, but it does not trigger collapse. Relationships grounded in emotional connection can tolerate fluctuations in desire because identity and worth are not dependent on constant affirmation. When a relationship deteriorates rapidly in the absence of sexual validation, it reveals the fragility of the underlying structure. What was being sustained was not closeness, but regulation. What was being reinforced was not mutuality, but dominance and reassurance. Seeing this clearly allows partners to stop personalizing the unraveling and begin making decisions from a place of understanding rather than guilt. This perspective does not require dramatic action or confrontation. It asks only for honest observation and internal alignment. By recognizing that the narcissist's response to sexual absence reflects external dependence rather than emotional depth, partners can reclaim clarity, reinforce boundaries, and begin to trust their own perceptions again. In doing so, they step out of a system that confuses validation with intimacy and begin reconnecting with a sense of self that does not depend on managing someone else's fragile identity.